to Secret Weapons, and today we're taking a look at The Surgeon by Matthews Effects. Let's start off by saying that I've hit a point in my life where I basically love any delay off the bat that has MIDI clock or external tap, but very specifically MIDI functionality. It saves me so much hassle when it comes to studio work, when it comes to especially the live performance aspect of playing guitar. MIDI clock feels so close to essential these days. And if you have something with MIDI clock, I am immediately at least interested in what you have and what you're bringing to the table. Enter The Surgeon by Matthews Effects. This is a new digital delay, very small format, very feature rich, that I am really impressed with, I have to say. What I like about this is it's pretty straightforward and simple, but has a lot of customization and functionality within it. So let's run through the feature set. So let's start things off nice and simple. You have 2 rows of knobs, 2 foot switches, and some ports on the side and some ports on the top. The top is your kind of like base level delay control. You have your dose, regen, and pulse, which essentially is just your mix, your regeneration, of course, your feedback, and your pulse is going to be your time. That is also swappable with the division knob right here, where you have a series of subdivisions directly below that pulse control that ties into this tap tempo right here. And then over here, these bottom left 2 knobs are going to be how you kind of instill and imbue character into the Surgeon. You have your mode control, which is 8 different algorithms subdivided across 4 different kind of key modes, being EQ, mod, AF, and dual. EQ being either high pass or low pass, mod being chorusing on your repeats with control over either the depth or the rates. The AF stands for auto filter, where you have control over the depth or rate, again, of a kind of like automatic filter that just kind of sweeps in and out. It's kind of band passy, where you get a very focused cue moving across that spectrum. And then dual being obviously dual delay, brings in a second delay line, which can be set to be kind of like untethered to your main time or locked into kind of complementary subdivisions, which is really great. So this little M right here stands for mutate, and that's going to be kind of the amount of any of those things brought in, mode specific, obviously. So EQ is going to be like the amount of filtering. Modulation, like I said, is going to be your rate or your depth control. And then the dual delay is going to be your kind of complementary subdivision, or the kind of like freewheeling time control for that second delay to kind of get kind of arrhythmic delay repeats alongside one another. You have your bypass down here. You have a preset or tap control up here, which is really great because you can save a series of presets in here that are accessible with or without MIDI, which is great because if you don't use MIDI, you can still get presets out of this pedal, and you don't have to like hop down and like flip a switch to get to them. You just press and hold and kind of roll through your presets. However, we have MIDI, and I think that's a big deal. Not just MIDI, but we have MIDI. You have MIDI in, MIDI out in 3.5 millimeter jacks down here, and you have a USB-C control, and you have expression. There's a lot of stuff going on in this delay. The USB-C port here is for your desktop editor, which allows you to make changes to individual parameters. It allows you to MIDI clock in from your DAW, which is really awesome. It allows you to kind of like manage your presets and everything, which again, really great. I've become a massive fan of delay pedals and just kind of any sort of time-based wet effect in general that gives you the ability to make changes to your stuff on a desktop editor. I just find that it's a fast workflow that I really appreciate. You also then have your MIDI in and your MIDI out, which is really great, and an expression control that can be set to control kind of any of the parameters on this pedal. I realize we've gotten this far through now, and we actually haven't talked about the sound of this delay. We've just talked about the feature set because, again, this is a pretty robust feature set for what we're dealing with here, for the size, for it being like a mono digital delay. There's a lot going on here. The Matthews Effects team really went hard on this device, and it's really cool, and it shows a lot. What we're dealing with here is a digital delay at its core, and we'll dive into this in the sound samples, but at its base level is a crisp, reliable digital delay. And from there, you get into all of those different modes. The chorusing on this thing is really wonderful. It might be my standout mode. I think it is my standout mode on this thing. The mod mode on this thing has a really wonderful chorus, and that time control, that pulse, gets down to kind of like double tracking, super like low time settings, which allows you to take stuff like that modulation control and actually use this as like a really good chorus pedal alongside using it for all of your delay stuff. And again, because you have MIDI, you can snap over to that and then get away from it as soon as you don't need it anymore, which is very cool. The dual delays offer a lot of added dimension, and as you'll hear when we jump into the sound samples, when you crank that regeneration way up, those high pass and low pass EQ settings actually provide a lot of really wonderful tailoring to that delay to give you long, dramatic, murky, droning beds of delay under your playing, or crisp, high-passed repeats that keep your playing clear and articulate without muddying up your reverb trails. So let's jump into some sound samples, because I think this thing is better listened to than talked about. I think that the feature set is very impressive. You have full MIDI control, like I said. You have CC values for all your parameters. You have presets. You have all of that stuff. So let's just jump into the actual sound samples. Let's listen to what all the modes sound like, and let's take the Surgeon for a spin. All right, before we get into our sound samples, as always, let's go ahead and talk through our signal chain and our context that we're working within. I am playing my Josh Williams Stella with a humbucker in the bridge and a P90 in the neck into the Origin Effects Cali 76, the Benson Germanium Boost, the Matthews Broker Dual Overdrive, the Surgeon, and the Mercury 7 in stereo to the Universal Audio Ruby Top Boost amplifier, which is basically a stereo AC30 amp in a box. From there, we go to our Pinstripe Pedals DISO Plus, which is our line isolator headed into our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna. Compressor, Mercury 7, Ruby amplifier. This is what that sounds like. So we'll go ahead and keep that mix on the Mercury 7 pretty low like that for the majority of this video so that we can kind of hear what the Surgeon is doing, but we're not going to take it all the way out for the most part, because I think it's valuable to kind of hear how this thing stacks into at least some reverb, because we focus on context-based reviews around here, and I, for one, and I think a lot of people on this channel tend to run a fair amount of reverb, so yeah. We're going to start things off with the Surgeon as best we can, bypassing the mode parameter stuff. And we'll just start things off by taking a look at dose, regen, and pulse. Dose being our mix, regen being, of course, regeneration, and pulse being our tempo. So with the EQ set to mode 1 down here and the mutate being at fully clockwise, we are not actually low passing anything, which is what the first mode on this EQ will do. So this will basically give us the most unobstructed version of our delay repeats. So let's give the Surgeon at its kind of core digital delay a listen. So before we get into the different modes on here, I want to go ahead and run through dose, regen, and pulse just to kind of get some baseline stuff. We heard our bass delay tone, this dose control down here. The volume taper on this, or the mix taper I should say on this, is a little interesting because past noon, you start to roll off your wets, or your dry tone, which is a little bit early for, compared to a lot of other delays on the market, but I think that does have a lot of potential for like great like ambient swelling kind of stuff. So obviously dose at 0 is no repeats. Then as you bring it up, and then you get unity right around noon. And then just past that, you start to kind of like roll your dry outs. And so it continues. And then of course, full wet. Okay, so similarly, we have the regen. Down here, you have a single repeat. And obviously that rolls up. And starts to get into runaway. One of the nice things that I've noticed about the Surgeon is that that runaway oscillation really takes its time. So we can push all the way out here to maximum. So you start to get that clipping, but it really doesn't overly swell volume, which is kind of really helpful. A lot of runaway oscillation stuff kind of eats up your amp really quickly. And then finally, pulse. So at minimum, you get like a close to 0. You can kind of hear that like almost double tracking sound. And that comes in really, really handy, that like almost doubling effect when you get up into the modulation modes. And we'll make sure that we touch on that in a few minutes here. And then as you roll through, okay, let's get back to a nice, comfortable, all knobs close to noon. And as always, I'm a huge fan of anything where all knobs next to noon sounds great. So let's dive into the modes here. So each of these modes, as we discussed earlier, actually is representative of two algorithms. EQ being a low pass first, a high pass second. Modulation being kind of a chorusing where you have control over either the rate or the depth with your mutate knob. AF being an auto flange, where once again you have control over rate or depth, and then dual being a second delay line introduced in that is either a separate subdivision relative to your first one using that subdivision control, or a completely freestanding and freewheeling delay line that kind of goes alongside your existing one. So let's start things off with EQ1, the low pass. And at fully clockwise, you are getting none of it. And as we dial it back, you'll start to kind of hear it come in more. So let's bring up that regen so we can kind of really listen to it. Slowly taper off and then taper off more quickly. So you can really hear kind of as you get past noon, that low pass kind of goes from really subtle to very pronounced. And that's really, really useful if you want kind of like long, droning beds that you can kind of play kind of sparkling leads over top of. So let's bring our delay time nice and slow and our regen really, really high and that mod nice and low. And you'll kind of hear how that low passing prevents our delay from running away and distorting when you crank that regen up by having it low pass away enough of the treble that you're not getting that kind of really aggressive oscillation, and it allows you kind of just to create these like big ambient droning beds that you can play on top of. And that'll just kind of drift forever, which is really, really great. So let's bring that regen back a little bit so that can kind of die off. And let's take that all the way to minimum so you can hear how fast that can kind of die off at its maximum. And yeah, the answer is very quickly. Conversely, let's go ahead and jump on up to mode number 2. And it's fitting that we're at minimum on this mutate knob now, because as you roll up, it will roll off low end out of your signal because we are now in high pass mode. So full delay fidelity again. As you roll that back, let's play some nice low chords. You can hear all that like low end drift out of those repeats really quickly. at maximum, you'll get really thin repeats really quickly. So the benefit of this mode, similar to the last one where we're getting these big, dark, murky, drifting drones. With this one, we take that regen way high and that pulse nice and slow. We can actually bring up our reverb quite a bit now. And if we turned that mutate all the way back down and played some like big low chords and then tried to kind of like improvise over top of it, let's hear how muddy that gets and how quickly that happens. So a lot of information all dragging through that low end really quickly. If we turn up that mutate, we'll start kind of cutting out a lot of that low end, and it'll allow us to get a lot more leg room out of our big reverb trails in conjunction with our delays. So let's give that a listen, that same kind of playing right now. Yeah, way more space available to us in that version of things. Okay, we are now in modulation mode 1, wherein we have a chorusing effect applied to the repeats, and the mutate control controls the rate of our modulation. So So this is where I like to kind of like find that interplay with the pulse and the modulation, because if you just heard what I heard, that's a really good chorusing effect on a delay. And so let's go ahead and take that pulse all the way up to that double tracking place, and then the mutate all the way down, and then we'll start to bring that mutate in to get some really good, real chorusing effect out of the surgeon on our drag guitar. and you can just get fully into kind of more of a vibrato-y kind of place. And then let's jump over to mod number 2, wherein that same mutate control is now controlling depth rather than rate. Okay, next up we have our 2 auto filter modes. Same rules as before. The first one controls depth and the second one controls rate. So with that mutate knob at minimum, we are getting no depth to our filter. Let's bring it up nice and subtle. Now let's take it a little bit dramatic. Okay, now let's jump over to auto filter number 2, which is controlling the rate of the filter as opposed to the depth. There's a little bit of a clipping thing at that kind of top point in that in the peak of that filter. I'm not sure if it's guitar output or if it's something internal in the pedal, but just be aware. I'm on the current most updated firmware for the Surgeon. There is a software editor for it, and I'm going to go ahead and send this little note on over to the Matthews Effects team, and if it is something inside of the Surgeon, and they do provide a software update that patches that, I'll be sure to notate that at this point in the video as well with like a card or something. Yeah, you can hear that. Okay, with the compressor off. I will say that the Q, the resonance on that mode is really, really high. I wonder if that's part of what's causing that. Because yeah, this is the mode I've had to bring that dose the lowest down for. And I still feel like I'm getting a little bit of that clipping thing. So yeah, be aware in this specific mode. So in my testing, I've not run across this issue with any other mode. And I didn't really notice it with any of my like single coil guitars. So again, be aware of all that kind of valuable context. And like I said, if there is a software update for this that does solve for this, I'll be sure to notate it in the video here. So let's dive into this last set of delay modes here. This is the 2 dual delays. And I would argue that these are my second favorite set of algorithms in the Surgeon after the modulation ones. I think that the chorusing on those is really, really wonderful and very lush and well-tuned, because I'm not crazy about all chorus delays on the market, and I really like this one. But so let's get into our dual delays. The first one is unsynced. So we've got ourselves set up to a quarter note here. As you can hear, it is tapped in, and it sounds like this. And as we kind of bring up this mutate control, this controls our unsynced delay in this mode. So let's bring that up a little bit. So we're now in our final mode on this thing. This is synced dual delay. So this mutate knob now controls a separate in-time subdivision to our main subdivision. So let's listen to it with the mutate at 0.